Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor Podcast. I'm Kim Scott.
I'm Jason Rosoff.
And I'm Amy Sandler. You know, most of us have encountered a person at work who always has a lot to say about those very important projects they're working on and how amazing they're going to be. This person is what Andre Spicer, an organizational behavior professor and dean of Bayes Business School, has called a loud laborer, which is hard to say multiple times quickly. Loud laborer. Should we try it, Kim?
No, let's go.
No. Quick laborer. Well, the term is new. The behavior is not. Attention-seeking folks who labor loudly love to talk about the work they're doing while actually doing very little of it. They're also more likely to gravitate towards highly visible tasks that make it easy to show everyone how amazing they are. Spicer writes for The Guardian that, quote, loud laborers have learned a crucial lesson from performance artists. Performance artists take nearly any aspect of their life and calls it art. The loud laborer takes nearly anything they do and relabels it work. There's no experience, no matter how ephemeral, that a loud laborer can't turn into weighty work. They show their unstinting work ethic by making their entire life into an endless assignment. End quote. I think we would only see that in a British publication, that lovely paragraph there. Kim, I think you sometimes call this a bloviating BSer. Is this a form of manipulative insincerity? What's happening here?
I think it's a form of obnoxious aggression. I think the bloviating, and I would love to get your all's thoughts on the difference. I think there's maybe, I don't want to try to, parse words too much, but I think for me, the bloviating bullshitter that is slightly different than the loud laborer. The bloviating BSer is the person who just makes stuff up, and assumes they're right. They assume they know more than they do. Sometimes they're not pretending to know more than they do. They actually think they know things they don't even know. And I think we've talked a couple of times about examples of me being a bloviating BSer. And a friend of mine called this sort of postulatory boldness. And I think we get rewarded for it too often at work. But I think that it's related, but maybe slightly different from the loud laborer. I don't know. What do you all think?
I think it is different. I think the point, although the end goal might be similar, which is sort of self-aggrandizement, I think, at least as it's being described in the article in The Guardian, and there was another article that Brandy shared, which we'll put in the show notes. The way that I understood it is, this is a person who is looking for others to give them credit for the work that they do. And in order to get that credit, they are sort of constantly talking about all of the stuff that they are doing. Even if the things that they are doing are relatively trivial, they are aggrandizing. They're making it seem more grand and more important by drawing attention to it. But in theory, at least, they are, it's not so much about what the person knows, but about what the person is doing.
Yeah, and I think that's... Go ahead, Amy.
Oh, I was just going to say, what was coming up as you were talking and Jason reflecting was around, radical candor is measured not at the speaker's mouth, but at the listener's ear. So it's almost like bloviating BS might be measured maybe more at the listener's ear, in that I might be experiencing something. The person might be saying things that might sound like BS, or Jason, I think the word you used was self-aggrandizing. How is it landing for me versus what your intention is? Like, Kim, if I heard you correctly, you self-identified as someone who sometimes might be in the bloviating BSer camp, because you tell me what's underneath that behavior for you. Like, what is your intention? What is that experience?
Well, I think, but before I answer, I promise I will answer your question, but I had a thought, and I don't want to lose it, which is, I think the loud laborer is trying to use sort of FaceTime to show I'm working. Mm-hmm. Like, what's behind the loud laboring is a desire to show that the number of hours. It's the kind of person who says, I worked 12 hours on this, as opposed to I did this great work and I got it done in an hour. They're not worried about efficiency. They're just worried about effort, only effort. And they're not worried about results. They're just worried about activities and showing that they're busy, creating activities. Whereas I think the bloviating BSer is sort of pretending to know things that they don't know, in order to either make up for lack of preparation or to sort of appear more confident than they maybe feel.
Yeah, that was actually where I was trying to go, which was about intent and impact and the potential differences. One thing that I'm curious about, and I am not an expert in loud laborers, apart from having read a few of these articles, but I would think it's not just people who are sitting at the office for 10 hours to show someone, hey, I was at the office for 10 hours, but also someone exaggerating what they're doing
Yeah.
for self-promotion. So I might be at I sent one email and like, oh my gosh, wasn't this a great email? So it's actually less about the sort of non-efficiency, but really more about getting exponential credit for things that don't warrant it.
Yeah, focused on getting credit. Yeah, I think that's right. And maybe taking credit for other people's work too.
I think that could be a side effect, but one of the things that struck me in the article, in the Guardian piece, was the quotation toward the end, and I think we referenced it in the intro as well, that they have a tendency toward work that is very visible. So like in a client services organization, they might have a tendency toward client communication, for example, right? So that because everybody on the team would have a reason to see that work, even though the real work is like preparing all of the information to share with the client, like that they would focus on, I want to be the one who sends the email to the client. That's the work that I want to do.
Yeah.
And so the side effect is like they're sort of taking credit for it, but the goal is to like choose the task that allows you to be really visible. And they might say, oh, I spent 8 hours crafting that email. And wasn't that email so great? I think a reaction to that might be, well, we spent 30 days preparing all the material. So like you spending 8 hours on that email is a minor contribution to the overall effort.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. And I think people are bloviating BSers or loud laborers because it works. And I think the solution is for a leader and the whole team to not let it work. Like if somebody comes in and says, I pulled an all-nighter, instead of rewarding them either with praise or sympathy or whatever, like, gosh, why did you have to do that? How can we make sure that doesn't happen again? Having that kind of reaction to there's like this I think we've talked before about the work martyr. And that seems to be part of the loud labor, whereas the bloviating BSer often comes in, they do the opposite. The bloviating BSer will come in and say, I didn't have to spend any time at all studying for the test. They were that student and I'm going to get an A, or I didn't prep for that sales meeting at all. And I just, landed the biggest deal of the quarter. So there's like a little bit of the opposite with the bloviating BSer. I don't have to do any work because I'm great.
Yeah.
Jason, when you were talking about, like, for example, in a client services team and in sort of one group doing a huge amount of effort and then someone else sort of putting it across the finish line, I'm curious, do you have any examples from your own career, whether here or elsewhere, where you feel like there's certain roles that take more of that credit?
Yeah, that's a great question. What was coming to mind is that I have sort of an allergy to people who are loud laborers. There was a person who I'm thinking of was like very early in my career who had a habit of putting together these sort of like lengthy documents to describe an idea and talking about how their postgraduate degree like informed it and all this stuff, like would like set up this whole thing and talk about how long they spent on it. And the problem was that it didn't deserve, like the idea didn't deserve that much work. So like as the person looking at it, you're like, you're trying to take $5 worth of credit for a 2-cent idea.
Yeah.
It's great. Like it's good to be proud of it, but it's very clear that they were doing this thing, which is they were talking up the way that they approached the work in an effort, I think, to make the idea seem more valuable. And the problem, to Kim's point, is like there were several situations in which it worked, in which like you could tell people were like, oh wow, like, you know, this is so well thought out and all this other stuff. And I'm kind of like, you know, they said we should add a refund button to the shopping cart. Like it didn't need a 10-page, you know what I'm saying? It didn't need the like that. It was that kind of a thing, and it led to a really tense relationship. I was at a point early enough in my career that I didn't quite have the skills to like productively deal with something like that, and so like I developed like the sort of like allergic reaction. Anytime he was going to present an idea, I had to like sort of steel myself. And I think that when I read the article, I read a little bit of that as like the impact it can have on other people, is that a person who continuously behaves in this way, it works for a period of time. And if it works for the boss, meaning like if the boss is sort of convinced by this behavior, it can work for a long time. And the problem is that person is other people who are laboring quietly start to become pissed off both at the person and at the boss for reinforcing the behavior. And so like that's why I think that's my understanding of why it leads to it starts to tank morale on a team, because anyway, Kim, I was thinking about your suggestion of like, how do you fix it? You fix it by not rewarding it. But I think it's especially important for the boss not to reward that behavior. Like it's one thing for your teammates to call you on it. It's quite another thing to make sure that the boss, like as a manager, you're looking out for this behavior and calling it out.
And I think it's also, I mean, this is maybe an overstretch, but I have a definite preference for a functional organization as opposed to an organization that is organized by business units. Because in a functional organization, the person who leads a team understands the expertise that is required to do the work and can call BS on that kind of loud laboring. Whereas sometimes when you have a general manager who doesn't understand the actual work that people are doing, it allows for more loud laboring. I mean, this was my big anxiety when I started a software company, is that, you know, I had studied Slavic literature. I had no idea what the software engineers were doing, really. And it made me very nervous, I think rightly so.
Yeah.
So, Kim, are you saying that what guidance would you give then for a manager who might feel like they don't have enough gravitas, perhaps in a functional area, to draw the line on someone that might have loud labor tendencies? What would you have needed to support you in laying that down?
Well, I mean, the most important thing that I did in that situation was build a really good relationship with my co-founder and CTO who could see through it, you know, and make sure that he was managing the engineers, not me, and not ever allow the engineers to go around him to me, because I knew that they could BS me, that because I didn't understand enough. I think the other thing, in another situation where loud laborers might get away with their loud laboring, was when I was leading at the AdSense team at Google, and there were a bunch of people on the team who were providing customer support. And because my manager, my direct reports, and I weren't in the queues answering these customer support questions, we often didn't understand what was involved in the work. And so actually sitting with them and doing the work with them on a regular basis was really important, so that we got it, so that we weren't befuddled by either loud laboring or bloviating BS. And
I think I would only add to that, I mean, is to be sensitive to it. If someone tells you that someone on the team is engaging in this behavior, I would take it seriously. Doesn't mean you have to like automatically assume they're correct, but it would be an opportunity. I feel like that's a call to pay closer attention to what might be going on.
It's so interesting. Like I'm flashing back a little to a team that I was on where there were a few of us that were at a certain level in the organization. And I think I had a belief system that sort of good work was rewarded of its own accord, and that, sort of internal promotion or PR for your own projects wasn't required. And so there was a peer in that group who was continually sending emails saying all the things that they had done and sort of continually advocating for themselves. And I'm aware, as I reflect back, that I didn't engage in that, what I would consider sort of self-promoting or self-aggrandizing behavior, and probably to my detriment. And so I know on a recent podcast, I believe we had talked about managers advocating maybe more for their quiet laborers. But, just Jason, for example, the situation that you talked about earlier in your career, you might not have seen that it was happening. What would you ask or think about someone who notices this? Like, how do you bring that to your manager in a way that doesn't feel like you're complaining, in a way that feels like it's helpful to the manager?
I will say that several people, including me, tried to find ways to talk to this person directly.
Mm-hmm.
Like we tried to, and again, like skill not matching will. I feel like we could have been more direct. Like, I could have used a lesson in core, right? Like to be really clear about the impact it was having. But we would say things like, hey, you don't have to like wrap everything in a presentation about how much work it took you to get to that particular answer. Like you can just present, like, we know you're working hard, just like present the answer to us. But I don't think he understood what we were saying. I don't think he understood that it was like frustrating and distracting, was actually making it less likely that people were going to listen to him.
Well, it's so funny as you say that, because actually what was coming up was Kim often talking about needing to show your work, right?
Yeah.
Like to show how you got there. So how do you balance sort of showing your work without being really annoying? Like, I spent 23 hours on this email.
There's a big difference between showing your work and like nailing your diploma to the wall.
Yeah. And I would say, like, this is a silly example of this, but like, and I may be projecting a little bit, but because this is sort of how it felt to work with this person. But I feel like it was the kind of thing where I'd walk by his office and he'd always be like, big sigh. He'd have like a big sigh. Oh, I've been working I've been here since 6 a.m. Like, it was one of those things where everything started with exasperation, followed by like I should get credit because kind of a thing. So in my mind, it's not even so much like self-promotion, like the sort of idea of confidently talking about the work that you're doing or the results. But Kim, you said this earlier in the episode, it's like an obsessive focus on effort and how much you are suffering to put forth that effort. It's a meta commentary as opposed to a specific commentary about the work.
Yeah, and I think there's also like there's a belief, which I think is that the more we suffer, the better our work. And I would love to have that belief replaced with what I think is a more accurate reflection of reality, which is when we're doing our best work, usually it's a joy, not a, I mean, there's always an aspect of work that is unpleasant. But overall, work should be a great expression of who we are as people. And when I have been doing my best work, I haven't felt martyred to it. I felt like I'm enjoying it. I'm lucky to be able to do this work. And that's the kind of work environment that we're trying to create, not this, the martyrs are, get paid the most.
Yeah.
I think that point about almost like really unpacking the cultural context that we're in is so important. Brandy had bubbled up a Rice Krispies commercial, I think from the late 1980s. I think Rice Krispies are still around, so people know what it is.
Yes,
but the commercial was really, this mom, of course it was mom, who had these Rice Krispies and didn't want the kids to know that she had not, in fact, sort of toiled all day making the Rice Krispies because they were so easy to make and so delicious, and so had to like pretend and spray like flour on her face that, in fact, these Rice Krispies took a really long time. But the reason why I think that's so interesting is like, what is the cultural message underneath it? I mean, Kim, it's sort of what you're saying, which is that if I got like a great output, if I made Rice Krispies in 30 seconds, like that's not enough. What actually matters is that I sort of tortured myself for 24 hours to make you these Rice
Yeah.
Krispies. Is that still an accurate cultural, like, are we still in that culture, or has that changed?
I definitely think like hustle culture is just the modern manifestation of that same phenomenon, which is like everybody talking about their side hustle and how they're doing 10 things at the same time. And isn't it like, it's so tough and I'm so tired. I feel like there's still that undercurrent still, from my perspective, is still very present in our culture.
Yeah, one extreme or the other. Either pretending it's easier than it is or pretending it's harder than it is. Why can't we just say what's really going on? Like, sometimes it's easy. One of the things that I did on one team that I worked with is I said, let's identify all the work that we are doing that we can stop doing. We can just quit doing it,
Yeah.
all the work that we can outsource, that we can get other people to do, and all the work we can automate. And that was really helpful in terms of sort of taking the wind out of the sails of the loud laborers and and also the bloviating BSers. Like, if somebody was complaining about something, the question was, well, how can we stop doing that work altogether? And often the answer was yes, we don't even need to do that. So, in other words, when people are like, there's a company called Joyous, where when there's some aspect of their work that is bothering them or irritating them, rather than sort of becoming a martyr to those irritants, they file a ticket that's almost like a software bug ticket. And the goal is to figure out what are the irritants that we can eliminate from your work so that you can work more joyfully, you know? And that's, I think, what you want to do. You don't want to silence complaints, but you want to air them in a way that says the goal is, if there are inefficient things or irritating things about your work, like, let's figure out how to get rid of those things.
I feel like we're we're touching up against something that we wanted to talk about, which is like, what if your job is actually BS?
Yeah. Well, and in fact, Jason, Kim loves the word BS. I think it's whether it's bloviating but in fact, there was a book written. It came out in 2019, I believe, by a professor at the London School of Economics, anthropologist David Graeber, who passed away in 2020. And there was a Vox interview, we'll put it in the show notes, where Professor Graeber, in this book that was called Bullshit Jobs, A Theory, and he was a leader of the early Occupy Wall Street. I believe this book came out of an essay that he had written earlier. Quote, bad jobs are bad because they're hard, or they have terrible conditions, or the pay sucks. But often these jobs are very useful. In fact, in our society, often the more useful the work is, the less they pay you. Whereas bullshit jobs are often highly respected and pay well, but are completely pointless, and the people doing them know this.
Yeah.
So what was an example of a bullshit job?
Well, one of them was corporate lawyer, I saw. But it was often a lot of folks that might be in more white collar jobs and middle management jobs, where people feel like they're not actually doing things, where if you stop doing your job, nobody would really notice. And what I thought was really interesting, because I was really curious, I hadn't heard about this book. And so I was trying to see, well, how did the thinking perhaps change post-COVID, and now where we are with AI? And that's where I learned that he, in fact, passed away in 2020, because he seemed quite prescient about sort of, there are certain jobs that we must have. And I think we saw that, in COVID, and sort of who are our sort of most important members of the workforce. And are we, in fact, reimbursing them accordingly to the value that's being provided? And there was actually something also quite poignant, that people in some of these BS jobs, felt the pain of feeling like you're actually not doing something that's really contributing very much to society, perhaps.
It's the superfluous man. A very important notion flowing through all of Russian literature is that I'm not needed, and my work is not needed. And that was a source of great anxiety for these folks.
I mean, I think I think it is a source of great anxiety. We touched lightly on the motivations at the top of the show, but I think that this is a high this is a motivation that we didn't include in that discussion, which is the fear of it being discovered that like your work actually doesn't matter. So you talk about it all the time and you say all the effort that you're putting into it, because the fear that you have is that people realize that the work that you're doing is not meaningful.
Actually, I had a moment where I felt like I had a bullshit job. So let me describe it, and you all can tell me if what I'm talking about is what David Graeber was talking about. So I was working. It was just a summer internship, but I was working at McKinsey, and I was sort of spending the summer like making beautiful decks. They had some special program. It wasn't even a PowerPoint. I think it was called Solo. And it was a really cool program. Like these things would look really good. And but it really felt to me like the work I was doing was sort of highly paid and meaningless. And not going to ever help anybody. But we were working really hard. We were working super long hours, but sort of changing. I mean, I'm exaggerating. And for those of our listeners who work at McKinsey, I apologize. Some of the work you do, I'm sure, is
well.
really
I've already
important.
offended corporate lawyers, but I was quoting to be clear.
I'm speaking for myself.
Some of my best friends are corporate lawyers,
but I was yes. But like. I joked. On my worst days, I felt like I was changing pie charts to bar charts and back again. You know, that is what I felt. And I was getting paid really, really well for doing it.
It's the hero's journey.
Yeah.
From pie chart to pie chart.
And back again. And then my sister, meanwhile, was teaching at a middle school. And there was a child who was suicidal, and she talked this child out of committing suicide. So like that to me was important work. That really, really profoundly mattered. And she was getting paid very, very little to do that work. And I was getting paid a whole lot to change pie charts to bar charts and back again. And that experience, that moment of talking to her that summer is kind of what prompted me to write a book called The Measurement Problem, which is about how capitalism is really good at rewarding what it can measure, but really bad at rewarding what is valuable. And I think, maybe some of these BS jobs, maybe they aren't actually BS, maybe they're important, but I do think there's a lot of jobs for which people get grossly overcompensated, and a lot of, and increasing. I mean, I think like the 1% problem is getting worse and worse and worse. And increasingly there's a lot of jobs for which that are really matter, for which people are not getting paid a living wage. Yep. And that is a big problem. I mean, that's like turns capitalism into a snake eating its tail. So
yes, it's happening in education. It's happening in healthcare. Like it is, the snake is eating its own tail. Like it's already it is manifesting itself. So it's not even like a what if. It is a thing that is happening in the world. And I think, to your point of the measurement problem in healthcare, what they're measuring is the profitability of the healthcare company, not the health outcomes of the community that they serve.
We're not measuring what matters.
Correct. And the people who are delivering those health outcomes, in most cases, they're not even doctors. They're nurse practitioners. There are these people who are closer to the sort of metal. They're like frontline mental health professionals that are actually like delivering these health outcomes. But the pay is disproportionately distributed to the people who have business line responsibility, who are responsible for the profit of the business unit, as opposed to the health outcome. So I think like. I guess in a world where capitalism exists, that it's not that job doesn't matter, but
it's overcompensated.
It's overcompensated,
grossly overcompensated, and maybe we're measuring the wrong thing.
Correct.
Well, that's why I'm wondering, Kim and Jason, as you're talking and thinking about the measurement problem, if you were, and you are co-founders of a startup, if you were creating a company now that you wanted to reward people whose work was valuable, or that we weren't giving incentives for people to behave loudly laboriously. I'm not sure if that's the right way to do it. How would you think about creating incentives in an imaginary new co that would reward the kinds of behaviors you want to see rewarded?
Well, Jason, we talked about this when we started the company. I mean, one thing that we decided we didn't want to do was follow the venture capital growth at all costs model of.
Yep.
And we also, I think we talked a lot about equity and kind of talked about how equity is the ultimate inequity in terms of how people get paid, and making sure that we do something that is more fair to people.
Yeah, I think like from a compensation perspective, there's a bunch of things that you can do. One of them is to ensure that in the world, like this has a chance to reinforce some of the things that are out there, but you don't want to make, there's like multiple layers of mistakes that you can make when you think about incentives. One mistake that you can make is you can pay someone unfairly for the job that they do, even given the unfair way that money is distributed in the world. You don't want to do that. So at the very least, you want to be like aware of what a job is worth and have some kind of process for making sure that the extrinsic rewards of a job match the value of the work that that person is doing as far as the world is concerned. And then you have a second thing to figure out, which is what extrinsic rewards, or how do you want to structure the extrinsic rewards inside the company so it feels like you are able to reward people equitably for the value that they actually deliver. So not what their job is worth, but for the value that they actually deliver.
And I think we should not necessarily say what their job is worth, but the market value of their job.
That is a better way to say
it. Yes. Their job may be worth much more than the market value of their job.
So that's somewhat of an inherent friction, right? Of if the market is valuing certain jobs, are you beholden then to following those market valuations?
No, I am not a slave to the market. I shouldn't say slave. I am not. Nobody is forcing me to obey what the market says.
Yes. And I would say that there is a pressure that exists to be able to, from like a labor law perspective and things like that, to be able to justify the choices that you've made. This is a place where like the law reinforces the economic system, because I think there aren't many other great models other than like a pure, like you one way you could think about it is like everybody works on commission. You know what I'm saying? Like everybody, we do some calculation where you say like your job was responsible for X amount of the revenue, and therefore your compensation is Y. Like a pure commission model is maybe one way to get away from this. So it's less about your title and it's more about your job, but there's still a judgment call to be made.
Often called a eat what you kill model, which is horrible.
Going back to violent language.
Yeah.
But there's still a judgment call to be made, because there's some activities that people are doing that are clearly adding to the money that the company is making, but there's not a really clear way to assign a specific value to it. So
there's a measurement problem. Going back.
Well, but it goes back to, Jason, your initial thing of like, your operations team is working like days and days and months on building this relationship. Then someone swoops in and sends the email that, seals the deal, and now they're the hero.
Yes. And I guess what I would say is like, I don't think there's a perfect system for extrinsic. I wanted to talk about extrinsic rewards first. I don't think there's a perfect system for getting extrinsic rewards to exactly match the value of an individual's labor, or the contribution of an individual's labor, which is why you need some sort of semi-flexible system like bonuses or like profit sharing or whatever else. You need some flexibility to be able to say, well, this year we want to recognize this person. That's going to be a fuzzy calculation, and that's the place where I feel like strict market valuing of jobs really falls on its face, because there are years where some people are going to do something that far exceeds what the market value of their job is. But the intrinsic thing, I think, is what's more interesting to me. And that's what we were talking about before, Kim. That's what you were talking about when you're saying stopping these behaviors. So like the question is, what kinds of behaviors, what are you trying to intrinsically motivate in people? What kind of behavior do you celebrate? So for example, I think in our organization, something we value quite highly is people helping each other. And helping each other is sort of, in my mind, is like the opposite of loud laboring, right? You can turn it into loud laboring if you're always talking about how much you're helping everybody else. But by rewarding people for helping each other as opposed to just getting their own work done, I think that's the kind of thing that can start to create intrinsic motivation to move away from some of the things that would make a job BS, right? Because like theoretically, that BS job that was being described is one in which going away tomorrow would have no impact. But if you are actually helping other people accomplish their work, even though you might not be doing a ton of the work yourself, you're still creating you're adding a lot to the organization, both culturally and from an output perspective.
I think also it's interesting to think about sales in this respect because, for example, at one point I had started a company, and one of the venture capitalists who had invested in the company wanted me to hire this salesperson. And this venture capitalist sent me an email that said, "This guy sold a $24,000 product for $500,000." And to me, that's a BS job. Like basically what you're telling me is that I should hire this person because they screwed the customer. And I said, no, that's not the kind of salesperson that I want to hire. And it's not the kind of company that I want to run. I want people I want a more consultative sales model. And at Apple, in fact, for the stores, they don't pay on commission, which was a controversial decision. But they said, people are gonna it's an unpleasant experience to be sold to in general. And so we're going to pay people to be helpful, actually. And we're going to pay people enough that we're going to take money off the table. They'll make about as much as salespeople in these jobs as they would if they were on commission somewhere else. And there was this concern, people are lazy, and so they won't really try to sell stuff if you pay that way. But that's not what the data showed. They actually enjoyed the jobs more, and the customers enjoyed being in the store more. In fact, here's another idea. I just got an email from someone who is creating an AI technology that'll help salespeople create pitches. And I'm like, okay, don't create that unless you also create an AI product that will talk to that person. So my robot can talk to your robot, and you can keep me out of the conversation.
They're pitching to each other. Our robots are.
I wish that we could get the video on that with Kim's robot talking. Well, I think that is what is so interesting. One of the threads in the loud labor articles that we were seeing was that there were often folks who were either underemployed or what was called fun employed, where you really didn't have like anything to do or enough to do. And so one of the ways to prove your existence was through this loudly sort of extolling all the things that you're doing. And there was a quote from Vox that said, there are endless reasons why people at work wind up with little, if anything, to do. Maybe the project they were hired for is no longer a priority. The tasks they were in charge of, by and large, are now handled by technology. I guess their AI is talking to Kim's AI. Maybe they never should have been hired in the first place. They were brought on board too soon. Maybe they're super fast at their jobs, or they're really good at being secretly lazy, hiding in plain sight. End quote. Kim just talked about, not that laziness isn't as common as we assume. Yeah. What was your reaction, Kim, to that?
I was trying to think of someone I've ever worked with who meets that description. And I can't maybe I'm just naive, but I've never actually.
Brandy looks like she wants to jump in.
Notice this happen. But Brandy, maybe you've worked with people who are in jobs like this. I've just never seen this.
I've seen it often. These are the people that would take credit for the work that I did and get awards for it. In my experience, they had usually been white men. They do a lot of glad handing, back patting, making people feel good. but there's no work actually being done unless the job is actually glad handing and back patting and managing up to saying I'm doing all these amazing things. But they're not doing the things. Their team's doing the things, and they're just talking about it, and they're having drinks with people.
And they're not giving the team any credit.
No, other people are getting awards for work that they don't even know who's doing the work, clearly. I mean, I'd done a bunch of work, and this person, somebody else, took credit for my work and was invited to the headquarters and given an award for work that I did.
And nobody.
And I remember being
on
the phone with his boss, like crying. I was new to the company. I said something to him about it like 4 years later, but
nobody else, like it.
Everyone was terrified there. So no, nobody said anything.
Yeah, I would say I have seen this. I have seen this kind of thing happen, but not in a way that the company just sort of ignored it. So at Khan Academy, one of the things about being donor funded is that sometimes a donor doesn't re-up. And so there's like work that was going on that was being funded by a particular stream of income, and that income dries up. And then the question is like, what does that person, like, what do we do now? Like there's a person or a team or a group of people who are working on a thing, and very soon there's some combination of they're not going to have anything left to do because we're wrapping that program up, or we're not going to have any money to pay them to do the thing that they're doing. But I think the reason why we didn't run into it is like one of the things that we were obsessed with was like using the money that we got as efficiently as possible, right? Because we were always limited. We were donor funded. So we were like the resources were always limited, and we were obsessed with being efficient. And so that it would never last. There might be a period of time where someone would be in a bit of limbo as we were trying to figure out, like, do we keep this person on and change their job in order to make sure that they have something to do? Or do we let the person go because we're wrapping up the project? Like, we'd have to make decisions like that. But so I could see it happening. And in a company that's big enough where money is not as tight, I could easily imagine a situation in which you have people who are just sort of like in these ghost jobs that like were relevant, 8 or 9 months ago, but there hasn't really been anything going on in that area for a while. And it takes a lot. I mean, I can imagine it happening pretty easily.
So Brandy, I think in the situation that you were describing, what I know what I would advise, like the CEO, to get rid of this layer of people who is just claiming credit for other people's work. But then I want to kind of brainstorm about what you could have done, because that is a much harder problem. But I think like if a CEO doesn't want these glad handers getting in between the people doing the work and the credit, so that the people actually doing the work are demotivated, I think it's really important to define the role of manager very carefully, and to expect managers to communicate to their bosses who's doing what, and to like give credit. Your job as a manager is not to take credit, but to give credit. And if I see you taking credit, then I'm gonna say, oh, you don't need a team because you're doing all the work. And to almost come at it from that point of view.
I think the people who get away with it are almost like cult leaders. They could be, not that these people are cult leaders, but how people become cult leaders. They make you feel good. They look you in the eye. Everything feels exciting when you're around them. So this is the kind of person that's managing the team, and they're making everyone from the CEO to the bottom feel like, oh, I'm a part of this great experience, but they're not actually doing anything but manipulating.
Yeah, they're kissing up. And then they're taking credit.
It's Kim, some of your favorite words like charisma, executive presence.
Exactly.
I mean, it's almost like sleight of hand. You know what I'm saying? Like it's almost like a trick. It's almost like a magic trick or an illusion that they're doing.
Yeah, but like at least in a culture, in a good culture, if you were to have said, actually, I did that, like that person would have experienced some really immediate and severe consequences for taking credit for your work. I mean, it's one of the
But you have
things,
to feel safe enough to say that.
Well, you have to
Right.
know that there will be consequences for taking credit for someone. I mean, at Google, if that had happened, that person would have been taken down several notches.
Yeah. So it actually happened to me twice when I first started and then actually right after I resigned, but I was still there for another month. And I did confront the second person. And then actually, no, I told HR and then they told her or told my boss. And then she Skyped me and was like yelling at me. And she's like, I thought we were one team. I'm like, one team does not mean that you take credit for my work. It means you say, look at the work that Brandy's team did.
Yeah.
This, versus saying like, I did all this work. That's not, that's how that went down. But I had nothing to lose because I had already resigned.
Yeah. That is unbelievable. That is an interesting way to weaponize the one team thing. And I'm sure that happens all the
we're
damn
a family.
Time. Yeah, we're a family. So what's yours is mine and what's mine is mine.
That's how this family works. Well, before we get into our tips, I just wanted to bring something else into this conversation about folks that might land in this, whether it's underemployed, fun employed, loud laboring, one team. This was from the Vox article, and this person that was being interviewed said, quote, I don't have a problem with being asked to do work. It's just I'm not really being asked. He said maybe he could take more initiative, but he gets good performance reviews and raises, so figures why bother? Plus, it's not like he can waltz up to his boss to announce there's no real business reason for his existence. How do I initiate that conversation that's, quote, hey, I haven't been doing much of anything this whole time. I need more to do. You don't really want to draw attention to it. And it was interesting because in this article it said, strongly suspecting that a certain person isn't doing much or not nearly enough to fill up what is ostensibly an 8-hour day seems to be a near universal work experience. Sometimes we're the less than occupied worker, and sometimes that's just how things have happened. And, just this is not data, but just one anecdote. I have a friend who is in an organization where there were a lot of layoffs, and they actually don't have very much work because a lot of the people that they were doing the work for are no longer there. And so I'm just curious, like, what would, again, that advice be if someone comes to you and says, how can you make it safe for someone to say, hey, I don't really have much work without feeling like, well, why are we paying you?
Well, I think, if we go back to, so one of the things I want to take, you said a bunch of different interesting things there, Amy. So before I once again, I'm not answering your question right away, because this thing happens in companies, the handshake problem. So the handshake problem, if there are two people, they shake hands once. And then with every person you add, the number of handshakes that have to happen go up exponentially or geometrically or a lot. I don't know.
That's a technical, this is why it's the measurement problem. It's a lot.
It's the correct mathematical term. But like by the time there's 100
Russian
people,
literature.
Yeah. By the time there's 100 people, think of how many handshakes have to happen. So you can't even ever get to your work because you spend the whole damn day shaking hands.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a problem. That's a sort of a coordination cost of a big team. And so one of the jobs of a good manager is to reduce the number of handshakes that have to happen. And that's by, breaking work down into its component parts. And so if you're in a situation where you've laid off a lot of people and it's, a couple of things can happen. One, you can find out you are very inefficient. Two, there may be, in about 6 months, you'll realize you've killed the business. You've cut the cost, but you've cut revenue more. And I don't know what's happening in that situation. So I think that's an important thing to consider. But like, if you think about what helps an economy be healthy, you don't want to rely only on the growth of the population because then we will overpopulate the work. You also want total factor productivity. And that is what managers are responsible for, is figuring out how to do things more efficiently. And when you do that, very often when you're focused on that, then what you're doing, and this is part of the reason why I said, what work can we stop doing? What can we eliminate? What can we automate? My promise to the team was, once we've gotten more efficient, I'm not going to reduce headcount. What I'm going to do is help you all figure out what take a step in the direction of your dreams. Like, what are you interested in doing? What do you think would help us grow the business now that we've eliminated all this grunt work? And that was what they cared about. And there was a lot of excitement around it. They wanted to grow the business, and we wanted them to grow the business, and our incentives were aligned once we made it exciting to say, I've got some extra time and I want to do this project. Special projects.
Yeah, and I was going to say, if I was speaking to that individual, I think there's a way to approach your manager and say, look, I'm eager to grow. I'm eager for new opportunities. I know there's a lot that's been changing in the business, and I just I'm putting you on notice that I'm open to opportunities to do other things inside the company. I don't think you have to talk about how little you're doing. I think you can talk about how open you are to doing new things. My guess is interestingly, in that situation, I'm guessing managers are freaked out that people are going to quit. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you've been on the other side of a layoff, like your manager is probably like petrified of losing anybody at this point, because they'd have no idea how they're supposed to get the work done that they're going to get done. And so someone raising their hand and saying like, hey, I'm here to help. If there are opportunities for me to do different things, like I'm excited about that, please point me in the direction of a thing that I can do that's going to help grow the company. I feel like managers would probably take that pretty well.
I think that's so helpful. Last point, which is actually an invitation for us to continue this conversation. What I'm really curious about is how this conversation is going to evolve, going back to people wanting to have work that has meaning, if not joy, going back to joyous. But now, in a world with ever advancing AI doing a lot more automation and other tools, how are we going to find meaning as our roles might be changing? So I think that's going to be a topic that I suspect we will be continuing to explore, and I'm curious in 6 months or a year where we'll be on that.
I think the important thing there is that everybody's got to find meaning in their own way. It's not the manager's job to tell the employees what gives their work meaning, because then the manager becomes the bloviating BSer of all time. It's the messianic bloviating BSer, which is the worst of all possible bloviating BSers.
Well, on that note,
let's get into some.
Let's get practical and tactical. Kim, over to you for tip 1.
All right. Tip number 1, remember the measurement problem. Too often we reward what we can measure and we do not reward what we actually value. So this all goes back to radical candor. Like, have those development conversations, hook into the sort of 2-minute impromptu radical conversation, hooks into a person's intrinsic desire to get better. And I think that is the sort of atomic building block of a great team. It's more important than performance management. I'm not saying performance management is unimportant, but focus on that intrinsic motivation.
Tip number 2, stop rewarding loud laboring. This kind of behavior is rampant because it works. You should know as a manager what's going on with your team well enough to see through loud laboring, which isn't actually producing real results. And you can only do this if you've taken the time to build relationships with the people on your team and get really curious about what's happening.
Tip number 3, it's going to be a throwback to a recent episode. We want to remind managers that it's part of their job to acknowledge and celebrate the work of the quiet laborers on their team. Make sure that you are sending up the chain. There's no boss that I've ever had that regretted receiving an email from me talking about the great things that people who don't typically boast about their work had done on my team. So take the time to do that. It's going to help you and it's going to help them in their career.
Can I add a tip number 4, an impromptu tip number 4?
Let's do it.
All right. So there's a interesting thing that happens where sometimes the loud labor or the bloviating BSers pretending like they're doing all this work that they're not actually doing. But other times they're not talking about activities, they're talking about results. The result, but sometimes those results just sort of happen, not as a result of anything that anyone did. And so I think the conventional wisdom is focus on results, not on activities. But sometimes you need to ask some questions about the results. I mean, I'll give you an example from my career. People, when they're writing, they're publishing a book, they'll often come to me and they'll say, why was Radical Candor? Why did it sell so well? What did you do? And unfortunately, the answer is, I have no idea. I It just happened. It just took off. And it's not because of any brilliant marketing strategy on my part. I did some stuff, but I also did that stuff for Just Work, and Just Work just didn't sell that well. So I don't know sometimes. And I think creating space, it's easy for me to be honest about that. It's harder for a person to be honest about that with their boss, but create space for people to say, wow, this great thing happened. And I don't even know why it happened. Help me figure it out.
I love that humility and curiosity. And I will just say there is so much good stuff in Radical Candor. Of course, there's
so much good stuff in Just Work too, but it didn't sell.
That's true.
It's fair.
I don't know. I've created space to not know. I'm in the not knowing.
I don't know either. But everybody could help us change that by
we
buying
could change
a copy
that right now.
Everybody who listens to this podcast buys 5 copies of Just Work. It'll be on the bestseller list. So there you go.
It's that easy.
It is. Apparently, it's that easy. That's how books sell. Just have Kim talk about it, and we'll go buy some books. Well, that is not a helpful tip on book sales, but for other tips related to feedback and culture, go ahead, visit radicalcandor.com/resources. We've got free learning guides, Radical Candor on Masterclass, our lit video book, our workplace comedy series, The Feedback Loop, so much more. Show notes, radicalcandor.com/podcast. Praise in public and private, and criticize in private. So if you like what you hear, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Brandy, is there a way for people to rate and review us on Spotify?
I'm nodding. If you're listening to us on Spotify, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
If you've got criticism for us, email it to podcast@radicalcandor.com. Do we have a favorite thing for today?
Yes. Today's favorite thing is my book. Just Work.
Oh, God, we have to do the video. That was so perfect.
Today's favorite thing.
Every day.
Not every day, but today's last week, it was my deodorant without any plastic. This week, It is, I'm going to sell my own thing. Just Work. Buy a copy of Just Work. If you want to buy an environmentally sound copy of Just Work, you can buy it electronically. You can listen to it. Or you can buy it in paper. It's not that many trees were killed in the printing of Just Work.
That is our new tagline.
A de minimis number of trees.
Yes.
Just really a small bush. All right. And with that,
Goodbye.
It's a wrap.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the Company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.